Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Real with Dr. Wendi, where we have real talk, real tools, and real change. I am your host, Dr. Wendi Watson, and welcome to another episode of The Real. Today's topic is understanding childhood trauma from survivor to clinician. So, we have a really special guest today. I know I say that in all of our episodes about our guests, but I believe all of our guests are special. Today, we have Miss Samara Bowser, who is not only a colleague, but she's also a good friend of mine. Samara is also a licensed clinician in multiple states. Here in North Carolina as well as Virginia. She is a school social worker as well as a medical social worker. Samara is also an expert in childhood trauma. So today's episode, she will share how childhood trauma can impact how children think, how they feel, as well as how they behave all the way into adulthood, and also share how we, as clinicians, as parents, as educators, can help them just kind of build a brighter and healthier future. So not only will Samara talk about her expertise in childhood trauma, but she'll also share some of her own personal experience of experiencing childhood trauma. She'll define what childhood trauma is. She'll also talk about how she was able to first recognize how her own personal experience impacted her life. So she'll talk about how parents can create trauma-informed environments for children, not only parents, but also educators. So we'll talk a lot about, what it looks like in relationships, what it looks like in behaviors, whether it's aggressive behaviors, whether it's non-trusting behaviors. So we are going to just kind of unpack a lot around childhood trauma today. So again, thank you for joining and stay tuned. And Samara, I'm just going to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do as a clinician.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I think this is a wonderful topic. I also think it's a wonderful thing that you are giving clinicians and individuals a voice, for the community. So I'm honored to be a part of this. So I appreciate it. But as Dr. Wendy mentioned, I am Samara Bowser. So I currently serve as a licensed clinical social worker in North Carolina and Virginia. I have a private practice. It is called One Journey Counseling and Consulting Services. And I have been in practice for about 6 years, working with children, adolescents, teens, families, and adults. Pretty much, providing treatment modalities for a lot of general mental health services as far as mental health disorders, anxiety, life transitions, women's health issues, depression, things of that nature. But I do specialize in trauma informed care, trauma informed therapy. And so, with my previous experience within community mental health and, just kind of watching and listening to a lot of adults that kind of came in to seek services, I began to notice that trauma was kind of like the foundation, that kind of sparked a lot of issues within individuals. So I came certified in a lot of trauma informed interventions, EMDR and trauma focused CBT for children. So, yes, I see and work with a lot of mental health disorders, but my specialty is trauma informed care.
Tell us a little bit about, what you're currently doing because you're doing some other things outside of your clinical practice.
So I'm also a school social worker. I work at a middle school here in Durham, North Carolina. Pretty much just kind of providing case management and doing social emotional learning for children in the school setting to address any barriers that prevents them from being able to, exceed academically in the school setting and working with families. And I also, work newly as a medical social worker, behavioral health in the emergency department at Wake Med. So that is triaging mental health needs of individuals that come in for that acute care, in addition to individuals who may be committed and have to spend some time in the psychiatric unit, pediatrics and adults, just kind of providing that mental health support and making sure that individuals are discharging to the most appropriate clinical setting as possible.
So very experienced, very well-rounded. What just kind of inspired you to enter the helping profession?
So, when I was growing up, I experienced a traumatic event for a while. And I'll just go ahead and mention briefly it was sexual abuse, and I began to act out. And I remember my mom telling me, she was just like, I'm putting you in therapy. And so I remember going to therapy, and I remember literally just sitting across from the therapist, and we're just looking at each other. She would often say things such as, why are you doing this? And, it felt like she was parenting me, and she also didn't look like me. And I grew up in a small town of, you probably never heard of. It's called Mount Ola, so it's near like Salisbury and Charlotte, kind of in between. And so there weren't a lot of people in that profession that just looked like me. I just felt like I couldn't connect with her. Nothing really came from that. And so my mom is also a social worker. She wasn't a clinical social worker, but I always would see her just kind of doing things for helping people. So I always said, once I got to school and graduated, I wanted to be able to be a woman of color and help people, who goes through a lot of different issues. So
Yeah.
that's what kind of sparked me into kind of coming into the helping profession.
I've seen you work with students, and I know how much they love you. I know your level of passion and compassion for the people that you serve. So, thank you so much for using your experience to help others, and thank you so much for sharing that, for your honesty.
Absolutely.
Um, why is childhood trauma such an important topic to discuss today?
I think it's important because it literally kind of impacts, or it plays a big role in how we function as adults. Regardless of a person's level of traumatic experience, or, how it has impacted them, it shows up. And when I began my practice, I began to notice that, as adults would come in and, they would find themselves in like repeated cycles and just unhealthy relationship after another. Um, Even within parenting, people just kind of being clueless about, why they were doing what they were doing. And so once I began to kind of explore, because as a social worker, we always kind of think about, what sparked this behavior. All behavior has meaning. I begin to see that childhood trauma played a major role in how we function as adults, how we function, how we see the world, how we live in the world. And so that's why I feel like it's important. And, when you think of just social media, I feel like trauma is being talked about a lot, is being normalized, that, not just you went through some things, other people have gone through some things, and seeing the level of resiliency. So that's what kind of sparked me into really zoning in on childhood trauma and really kind of sticking with what is this foundation of a person's well-being, and how can I help them kind of get on the other side so they don't have to repeat, how they responded to the trauma, and why they're going through what they're going through.
You make an excellent point that, childhood trauma, once when someone experiences it, it impacts them all the way into adulthood.
Mhm.
So we see some of the behaviors, the decision making, the unhealthy relationships, and it can impact them in many, many different ways, and it can show up in many different ways. And so we don't always understand what's going on with the person. So yes, it is very important for us clinicians, teachers, parents to be able to understand that it can show up in behaviors. I also think it's important to say that trauma, childhood trauma, can refer to experiences, you know, in terms of defining childhood trauma. Well, let me just let you just kind of define what is childhood trauma.
So I think, it can be defined in a lot of ways, but in a nutshell, it is defined, by any situation or experience, event that has impacted a child's ability to just cope or to feel safe. Um, or just to function.
Yeah.
And it just impacts them in a lot of different ways, what you just mentioned. And it's not always, of course, it is the event that has occurred, but it's also how they responded to it. And so I feel like that is pretty much what childhood trauma is and how they responded to it. It kind of allows a person to see, how they're functioning. And I think sometimes we are conscious of how we're functioning, how we're responding to like a trigger or a trauma reminder, but a lot of times we're unconscious to it. And that's where, it kind of, shows up in a lot of our different behaviors. So that's how I would define childhood trauma.
A great definition of it. Anything that any experience or anything that overwhelms the child's ability to function. And it doesn't have to just be sexual assault or physical assault. It could be bullying.
Mhm.
It could be community violence. It could certainly be, parental substance use. If there's a parent that's on substances,
Mhm.
um, the loss of a loved one. And so I think we have broadly when we define what trauma is because I work with youth and we had an event where we discussed trauma and some of the youth didn't even understand
Yeah.
that they had experienced a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Having a father that has been in prison all their life, that can be traumatic to someone.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you make a great point. It can be any situation. It's just how does the person respond to it?
Yeah, and even as a school social worker, I'm glad you mentioned those examples, because I think we think of just like abuse, but absolute community violence, even if there's a child in the home that is has special needs and requires a lot of attention, like that parent may not be able to equally distribute affection and attention, all of those different things, significant, consistent poverty, housing, like all those different things play a role in how a child develops.
So, as someone who has experienced childhood trauma,
Mhm.
when did you first recognize how these experiences impacted your life? You mentioned, you were sitting across from this therapist and you all were just staring at each other and not really able to connect.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that your mom said, "Okay, I'm going to take you to therapy."
Mhm.
Maybe knowing that something there needs to be some type of intervention, but maybe not understanding what type of intervention. But when did you recognize
Mhm.
that how those experiences impacted your life?
I think I recognized them then, but I wasn't looking at, because I felt like I had complex trauma. It wasn't just a sexual abuse. Like my dad was addicted to drugs, and he was in and out of rehabs. It was just a lot, going on. So I recognized that, and I felt like I was seeking love, in all the wrong places. Because my behavior showed up in the love that I was seeking from this boy. I was in love with this boy, okay, and he was no good for me.
Yeah.
And so I began to rebel against my mom, and I would blame my mom and tell her that it was her fault, that she wouldn't allow me to get love from this guy. And so I knew it then, but it really didn't settle in. But as I got older and as I went to college, my mom only knew of that one part of the trauma, but I disclosed to my mom right before I went to college that I had been sexually abused by my father for several years. And when I got to I told her because I didn't want to carry that weight any longer. I felt like once I got rid of it, it wasn't going to be a part of me. I wouldn't have the nightmares, none of that stuff anymore. But that didn't stop. I struggled with maintaining relationships, like healthy relationships,
Yeah.
not just with male partners, significant others, but just with platonic, with my friends, oftentimes when you go through trauma, you're going through it by yourself. And
Yeah.
so I didn't know how to make myself vulnerable. So I didn't trust people. So I began to notice that, I just didn't trust people. I couldn't keep friendships. And I also had an addictive behavior, which was unfortunately shopping. And so as I just got older and, just suffered different consequences, those are some of the red flags, that I began to notice fairly quickly that those were just replacement behaviors of how I was just coping with when I would be triggered or what I had gone through or what I had experienced. Because your brain doesn't always know that you're no longer in that need for survival mode. You know what I'm saying? So that's when I noticed. I know that's a lot, but that's just some of the things that I began to quickly notice that they were not working in my favor,
Yeah.
it was an impact of the trauma. Yeah.
But that was good because what we tend to see sometimes is the same behavior in our young girls.
Mhm.
I'm working with teenagers now, and so we see the same behavior, they are rebelling, and we
Mhm.
know during adolescence, we there's a lot going on.
Yes.
You're trying to you're developing in all different domains, so socially, emotionally, mentally, physically. So there's a lot that's already going on.
Yes.
Trying to figure out who you are, trying to fit in, trying to be liked, and as you said, trying to be loved.
Yes.
So as you're trying to navigate all of that,
Mhm.
and then you throw trauma on top of it, so then yes, there is a behavior that's developed. And as you mentioned, I'm just trying to seek love.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so oftentimes it's with the opposite sex. It's with a boy or a girl. And then our parents don't understand the behavior. And so then you're labeled as, oh, she's just promiscuous.
Yes.
Not, and so now you're looking at the behavior as opposed to what's happening.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's a great point that you make because we see it all too often,
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
too often.
Yeah.
Um, and so as I was talking about development, how does childhood trauma affect, brain development and emotional regulation?
Mm. There's a part of, many parts of your brain, but I do know that the prefrontal cortex, and we'll use that part, and the amygdala. So when they're the prefrontal cortex, its basic function, is to provide executive functioning, all those different things, decision making. And
Yeah,
so anytime you experience something traumatic, your brain stores what it experienced. And not only does it store what it experienced, it stores, like I said previously, how you responded to it. So
yeah,
any type of perceived threat, which are triggers that comes about, your brain kind of sends off an alarm system. That's the amygdala, just basically telling you, like it's literally hijacked. Like, are we gonna run? Are we gonna
yeah,
freeze? What are we gonna do? And so, because that is impacted, and even as a child, keep in mind, as you just said, Dr. Wendy, your brain is still developing. And so, when something impacts that brain, it begins to prioritize just surviving versus what it's supposed to do is just function. So, you're
yeah,
just operating off of survival mode because you feel like, or you can feel like, there's some type of perceived threat. So that's what it pretty much just it does to the brain. It prevents the brain from truly functioning in the way that it was designed to exist. It's always, kind of like ready to see something or figure out what do we need to do when something happened, you know? So that's the best way I can explain it without becoming too technical. Yeah.
That's a perfect way, for, our listeners to understand, whether we have parents that are listening,
Mhm.
whether we have youth that are listening, young adults. That was a perfect way. And as you mentioned, what happens is the trauma interrupts the development of the brain. So it's not developing in the way that it should. Instead, the brain learns to be on high alert.
Mhm.
And so if the brain is on high alert all the time, right, it does negatively impact the way that you can develop healthy relationships.
Yes.
So, as you mentioned, not being able to develop and maintain those healthy relationships, you just kind of experience that. So, always on alert, that means that you can't develop trust,
Mm-mm.
right? So, and of course, we need trust. So, you build this or create this person that's always on high alert. And then you have that emotional dysregulation.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you go through it silently, which a lot of kids go through trauma silently, like the aftermath of it, you don't have that understanding of how to like
Yeah.
properly cope with what you're going through. And, I take, for example, you're witnessing domestic violence in the home and your mom, you see her crying afterwards, or if you see your father crying afterwards, and you see a lot of anger, like as kids, we just don't inherit like physical characteristics of our parents, like eyes and hair and skin color. We inherit how they deal with stress,
Yes.
how they have gone through trauma. And so you're left to kind of do that on your own. So think about physically, your brain is developing, but it's also trying to figure out, okay, is this how I deal with anger? Is this how I deal with fear? It's just a lot that is placed on a child that definitely impacts how they see the world. And imagine having to go to school after
Yeah.
experiencing something traumatic. And, it's just really a difficult, fearful experience for a child.
Yeah. And, as you mentioned, the social learning theory, right, is they pick up, or their behavior is influenced by their environment.
Mhm.
So what they observe, if I'm observing my parent, you know, going off or not managing their emotions, well, I'm going to learn or pick up that same behavior because I'm observing it.
Yeah.
Right? I can't just kind of figure it out on my own. How to self regulate when no one around me is self regulating.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, yeah, that's important. The point that you bring up, the difficulty managing the emotions, controlling impulses, trusting others, and then learning from their parents, their environment.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah, what are some long-term impacts? I think we talked about that. Long-term impacts of untreated childhood trauma. We talked about the inability to obtain and maintain or develop healthy relationships.
Yes.
Not trusting, the emotional dysregulation. So yeah, that can
Mhm.
follow us all the way into adulthood.
Absolutely. Even self-identity, just not knowing who you are as a person, as a man, as a woman, self-esteem, self-confidence. Um, Another thing I'll be transparent, that I'm still, kind of working through is, I did mention, just how if you go or experience significant poverty, I didn't experience, poverty growing up, even though my dad was addicted to substances, but I experienced my mom struggling financially. And so that embedded in me, that I needed to stay financially secure. So I felt like I struggled with financial anxiety that's developed all throughout, just me being as an adult. And so it impacted my ability to, like trust my husband that he can handle this,
Yeah.
handle that, so those just are other ways that it just shows up, and just
Yeah.
what you experience. Yeah.
I can definitely relate to that. Growing up in a single parent household and my mom just kind of struggling to take care of us. But even leaving home at a young age and having to struggle financially myself, now it shows up when I have to make sure I am financially stable. Like I have to have two and three jobs
Yes.
and
You preaching.
And, how does that impact me, in terms
Mhm.
of stress, just to make sure I'm not struggling.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, I
Mhm.
I can totally relate. So there are so many different ways that trauma can show up in a person. And if we're not aware, if we don't have that insight, that self-reflection, um, or we don't have any help in just kind of processing what is happening and exploring self, then we tend to suffer, like you said, in silence
Yeah. Mhm.
and trying to figure out, well, what's wrong with me?
Absolutely. And you develop like these negative core beliefs, these self-limiting beliefs about yourself because it's how you see yourself in the world or how you see relationships, like if I don't have, if I don't feel like my self-worth is where it needs to be, because I've been in all these unhealthy relationships, like I could, or I grew up like that, I could have the belief that you can't trust men or all men
Yeah.
abuse women. So I come in relationships just seeking that, like you attract what feels and sounds familiar to you, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So what does healing from childhood trauma look like?
So I think it looks different. Clients ask me that all the time when they come to me. Some of the buzzwords I hear, I want to do reparenting, I want to do inner child work, all those different things. And they always ask, how will I know when I've been healed? So what I always tell people is, get it out of your mind. Like you'll never be able to change what happened to you. You have to be able to kind of come from a lens of I'm going to change how I've been responding to it. So once you identify, how you've been responding to it, how it has impacted you, and then you begin to get on the other side and the miracle question of, if this never happened to me, or if I am completely healed from this, then what do I want my life to look like? Or how do I want to function in the world? And so that is how I allow clients to identify what their own healing looks like, because I can identify it all I want to, but I'm not functioning in your world. So I know that sounds, like maybe I didn't answer the question, but I think healing looks different for different people. But I do know that even though the brain has been impacted and some people may feel like, it's no longer going to work the same, your brain can be healed, with a
Yeah.
lot of these different trauma informed interventions, learning how to teach your brain because it's a muscle, that are safe. You don't have to operate up under that perceived level of threat or danger anymore. So, in a nutshell, I feel like that is my lens of how I feel like healing can occur, and how I try to encourage individuals to identify what their own healing will look like.
You're absolutely right. It does look different for everyone. There is no, cookie cutter way of even addressing trauma with individuals. It's person centered, is what works for you. And as you mentioned, which is very important, as clinicians, we can't define what it may look like for our clients. We have to allow them to define that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you certainly answer the question,
Hmm.
uh, the fact that it looks different for everyone.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, and that just goes into the next question, can people truly recover from childhood trauma?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, people may not understand, what their pre trauma level of functioning was. Sometimes people are, especially, depending on, the type of trauma and when it occurred. But some people don't recognize, like, what a life could have looked like or how they should have been functioning, pre-trauma. And so being able to have an understanding of that, it allows, the clinician, or life coach, to be able to guide you along, throughout the journey of just healing and operating. You hear the buzzwords like the best self, most authentic self,
Yeah.
but I always like to look at it as like, what is the best version of you? Like how do you visualize yourself functioning?
And is that sometimes difficult when you have someone that have experienced, childhood trauma at a young age because they may not know what it looked like, what it felt like prior to the trauma. Because they were so young and now here they are an adult.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I can assume that can be difficult, but also they understand what they've gone through
Yeah.
since the trauma up until the time that they enter into treatment. And it could be, I want to be able to maintain healthy relationships. I want to be able to trust people. I want to be able to not have nightmares anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could be, they are upset with their parents,
Yeah.
so sometimes, it's a journey, and sometimes when people come in with so many complexities of trauma, there are different parts that you have to kind of deal with before they get to, you know, the root of everything or, the true healing they want to experience. So, that's why I love EMDR. It is definitely a really good treatment modality that allows an individual to kind of explore certain parts, that they have experienced, and they may find it as if, they no longer need to entertain those parts any longer. It may mean that they have to practice a level of forgiveness. Forgiveness
Yeah.
is a lot of work within itself. Forgiveness is ongoing, okay? Trauma work is ongoing, but you just get to a point where you're self-sufficient enough that you have the tools to be able to kind of function, where you may not always need a therapist to kind of help guide you,
Yeah.
Self-awareness is key. And once you're aware of how you're functioning and how you're navigating life and being open to producing some type of change, 9 times out of 10, you're able to function, very well as if the trauma no longer happened. Yeah, like you no longer see life as a threat. That's what it is.
Yeah. You're able to be safe, feel safe,
Yes.
because that's what's most important. The healing begins with safety.
Mhm.
And you made a great point that it's a ongoing process.
Mhm.
And so if people are thinking that, hey, in 2 years in therapy, I'm going to be fine. No, that may not be the case. It just depends on the person.
Right.
But one of the great points you made is the tools.
Yes.
Having those tools.
Yeah, you can't forget them. And I'll be quick. I experienced, my abuse long, long time ago. And I've been through therapy. And I've, been fine. I went to go get a massage last Friday,
Yeah.
and a moment that's meant to relax you, you're not thinking anything of it. I
Yeah.
ended up being triggered. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and so long story short, she wasn't the best massage therapist, but when I was asked to lie on my back, normally I'm fine, but it was the way that she felt like I wasn't relaxing. But
Yeah.
what she didn't understand is my body will automatically tense up in certain positions or certain ways that a person is going to touch me as a sexual abuse survivor. And
Yeah.
so she became very frustrated with me because she was saying, "You're not breathing properly, you're not this." And so my initial instinct was to get up because I felt like she was not being patient, but she was a threat. That's what my brain was telling.
Yeah.
But I had to literally have that self-talk like, "Samara, you're okay. She doesn't understand what you've been through." Just block, like, I literally had to walk through the tools that I've been taught that work for me, because the tools not gonna
Yeah.
work for everyone. But that
Right.
just speaks to what you were just saying, like, it's an ongoing journey, and at any given moment, you can be triggered, but you have to be able to utilize what is now a part of you. You keep your tools with you at all times. I tell kids, keep your backpack on. And in your backpack, those are your tools to help you survive at by any given moment.
Oh, that's a wonderful example, and thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for your transparency, and I think that will help the listeners.
Yeah.
It's a great example of I have to use the tools, right? Because you learn them. It's one thing to learn them, and it's a whole nother thing to utilize them.
Yes.
And you may use them one day and they don't work, but you have to keep it's practice.
Yes.
It is practice, and I can totally relate. I grew up in a household where there was a lot of emotional abuse and physical abuse.
Mhm.
So I ended up not having a good relationship with my mother. And so now, she is experiencing dementia, and I'm the only one that is showing up.
Mhm.
And so I've had to forgive. I've done that. I've done some work on myself, but there's sometimes things that she says to me that triggers me, and it makes me want to respond
Mhm.
or react.
Mhm.
And I have to, yes, practice self-talk.
Mhm.
Tell myself, Wendy, it's okay. You've done the work on you. You can't change anyone, not even your mother. And so I have to remind myself, have compassion, have, empathy.
Mhm.
But at the same time, being able to protect myself as well.
Yeah.
Um, so in talking about parents and educators and even communities, how can parents create a trauma informed environment for children, and not only parents but even educators, because we just said that trauma can show up in many different ways, different behaviors, and we tend to see it in our young kids at school that don't know how to process it, so we see it in behaviors. And so how can even our educators create that trauma informed environment for our youth?
Absolutely. I know for educators, regardless of what level, of educator you are, you have to kind of understand or try to get to understand the meaning behind the behavior, developing that relationship, with your student. I know on the collegiate level, you might have a little bit more time to kind of get to know the student just a little more because you're seeing them for longer periods of time and, they're adults and they come and talk to you a little more. But on like an elementary level, middle school level, this is where the work really needs to occur, instead of, trying to push them off, as in they need medicine, they need this, and just being judgmental. Begin to allow that child or, to feel safe by talking, by, showing that you care. It's just so many trauma informed approaches that educators can definitely take. Try to establish a good relationship with the family or the caregiver, because if kids can see that you have a good relationship with their parent, they don't fear being able to talk to you about what's kind of going on,
Yeah.
Um, I would say, and even with, go back to educators, if we had more clinicians that are allowed to come in the schools to develop these trauma informed schools like are occurring all throughout other states in the United States, it would be awesome. Okay. Because
Yeah.
it works. For parents, everyone parents differently. And I think you just mentioned, if you're growing up in a home where a parent is just, they've experienced trauma,
Yeah.
to prevent repeating the cycle,
Yeah.
allow your child to feel safe in talking to you about anything. Don't try to make it about you all the time. Sometimes you have to sit with your child and like, well, tell me, why are you so upset with me? Or how do you feel about this? I know within Black families, I grew up where it's like, you don't have a voice, you do as I
Yeah.
told, what you crying for, you ain't got nothing
Yeah.
sad about. All
Right.
they throw those out the window, okay?
Especially the one, sorry for cutting you off, especially the one you don't pay any bills, so you
Yes,
don't have anything to be upset about, you don't have any stress.
yes, that's the
Yeah.
one. We have to throw all that out. And I know, our ancestors meant well by saying that, but we are living in times where kids are experiencing stuff not just in the home, but at school, on social media, just TV, just all different things. So give your child the space to talk about different things. And I bring issues to my kids, and not just because I'm a school social worker, but when I hear them say things, or I might see things on TikTok, I'll be like, well, what do you know about that? Or if someone says something to them in a way and I can just tell their mood is a little different from their normal baseline, what's going on with you today? Just be mindful, check in on your kids, allow them the space to express and to talk freely, non judgmentally. And that goes a long way, a long way.
Invalidating, not only checking in with them and finding out how they're feeling, but also helping them to identify what the feeling is.
Yes.
Because, yeah, sometimes they don't even know what the feeling is.
Mm,
We can have many, many feelings going on, but it displays as anger or it displays as, frustration. And so I think it's important to help kids identify what it is that they're feeling. If they're hurt, if they're insecure, help them identify that and validate that.
mm-hmm.
We have to move away from, making our kids believe that they're weak
Yes,
if they, especially our boys.
that's the one. Mm-hmm.
Yes, making them feel that they're weak because they have feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I work with youth, and what I tend to see is the communication.
Yeah.
And let me just say, parents, caregivers, if you're listening,
Mm-hmm.
by no means are we trying to tell you how to parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we are not trying to tell you how to parent,
Mm-mm.
but we are working with these youth and we are hearing what they are saying,
Yeah.
especially these teenagers. I work with teenagers that are saying, because we create a safe space for them in our group counseling, and so we make them feel welcomed and they feel like it's a safe place for them to talk about what's going on with them because they don't have anybody else to talk to, or they feel like
Yeah.
they don't have anybody else to talk to. So we hear things like, it's the way that they disrespect me. We're calling them names. We're saying that they're no good. We're saying, we're
Mhm.
maybe upset with their father because maybe the father's not there or he's not doing enough. And so we're taking it out on the kids. And so there is power in the tongue.
Yes.
What we say to the kids, the word says it'll cut you like a two-edged
Mhm.
sword. I
Mhm.
gotta tell you, growing up, I was cut deep
Yeah.
with things that were said to me that I still feel today. We just encourage that we're able to have an effective communication with our kids, because that is one of the things that we're hearing. They want to be validated. They want to be heard. They want to be valued. They want to be loved.
Yes.
I mean, what would you say to the single parent mom who's taking care of multiple kids and may not, working two and three jobs and may not have time, that's constantly frustrated? What would you say to that parent?
Definitely build your village, your support. I don't care if it's one person, that you feel like you can trust, we need each other. We need other people. That's one thing to do, just if it's only just to, you know, give you a break or allow you to be able to vent about what may be going on in your home with the kids. And then, make sure you take time out for yourself. Like, I think as a single mother, and I watched my mom and my dad moved out, like wearing the hat of mom and social worker, and she was a daughter, just wearing many roles, many hats. The parenting hat, she never took it off. And even though you take it off, it doesn't mean that you're no longer operating in that role. It's like you're giving yourself permission to just be you because you have to find ways of to be able to reset and to refocus because if not, the world frustrations, life frustrations, it's going to
Yeah.
come out, and it may not be, intended for harm. But as Dr. Winnie just said, what you put out is absorbed through your children, your movements. You don't want your child walking on eggshells because they don't
Yeah.
know if they're going to say something or ask for something. I remember that was the stressor trigger for me. Like I didn't want to ask because I knew we didn't have, but I was afraid that I was gonna make my mom upset or cry just by asking for like a new pair of shoes or something like that. So,
Yeah.
you may not be able to provide, but that's what the support and that's what the time, for you to kind of disconnect and just kind of refuel you is definitely needed for a single mother, single parents.
That's good, and I would also to add to that, I just believe it's okay to be vulnerable with your kids,
Yes.
especially if you have teenagers,
Yes.
because they understand a lot more than you think they do.
Yes.
They are very smart, they're very self-aware, and they want to help. I grew up in an era where, one, you don't tell people what's going on in your household.
Right.
You keeping these secrets, and you won't even let your own family know what's going on with you to be able to help you.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to ask for help is going to be important. And whether it's at church, whether it's at getting you a therapist, it's
Yes.
okay to get a therapist.
It's okay.
It is okay. How many times have I come to you, Samara, and had to talk to you about what was going on with me, and
Mhm.
just being able to have someone listen to me, help me
Yes,
process,
yes,
help me.
yes. It's so helpful. It's so helpful. It has so
Yeah,
much power in just being validated. You know what I'm saying? Like we stay in our heads all the time, just
all the time.
processing all these tabs of worst case scenario and feeling as if the people we're being perceived as this and that. It's just so much. So just being able to have someone to be vulnerable with that validates you, it is like mind blowing. I'm telling you, so don't look at therapy as if something is wrong with you. Think of therapy as going in so that you can have someone to help
Yeah.
validate and reassure and just reset you.
And it's a level of freedom that you get.
Yes. That's the word, freedom.
Yeah, it's a level of freedom. And it's okay to love the Lord. Trust me, I love the Lord with all my heart, mind, body, and soul.
Uh-huh.
But I also believe that the Lord has put people in my life to support
Me
me.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, yes, we can pray about it, and prayer works,
Mhm. Mhm.
but there's some other things that we can do.
Yeah.
I also think it's important to remember that trauma informed care asks a different question. So instead of asking what's wrong with the child, it asks what happened to the child.
Yes. Yes.
So when we were just talking about how educators or mentors or other people, caregivers, parents, right? The trauma informed lens, and we always want to be working from a trauma informed
Mhm.
lens, right?
Mhm.
Because we don't know.
No.
But instead of saying what's wrong with the child, ask the question, what happened to the child?
Yes. And you'd be so surprised how many IEP meetings or just parent teacher conferences, that I've sat in and I've asked that question. And I always say, like, all behavior has meaning. I say that to teachers all the time. And they look at me like a deer caught
Yes.
in headlights, like, well, that's because they're not doing this. Where you're making all these assumptions. Let's not assume things about kids. And let's fact check. Let's figure out what's going on. So yeah, definitely. What happened to this child?
Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot of time
Mm-mm.
to explore what has happened. just having empathy and compassion when we do see these behaviors, because we're seeing a lot of kids being expelled from school. They're being, their academics is failing. And, something has happened.
Yeah. Or even placed in the wrong educational setting because you expect
Yes.
them to sit through a 3-hour educational test to see the most appropriate setting and they're sleep. Well, they might have slept in their car all night, or they might have been up, like
Yeah.
give them a second chance or, build just finding different ways to get things done, instead of, oh, they didn't do this, so they're gonna be placed here or they're gonna be placed there. And I understand with time and money is not always on our side in the educational world,
Yeah.
but you know, trauma informed school psychologists are very, very important. Very, very important.
And even, yeah, those school social workers.
Yes. We
Definitely. Definitely. So my should I say closing question? I may have two closing questions.
Okay.
But one is, what message would you give someone currently struggling with the effects of childhood trauma?
Would tell them it's a journey. Yes, something happened to you that you had no control over. But there is life that is satisfying and peaceful throughout the healing journey. But trauma and healing is a journey, you know, and it's nothing that you can't overcome because I always tell my clients, you've already overcame the worst part of it, So let's figure out, how to function, now that we've gone through it, So that would be my message. There's nothing that you cannot overcome. You just have to put in the work and you have to be patient with your therapist and with yourself, most importantly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so my last question, how has your lived experience with childhood trauma influenced the way you connect with and support clients today?
You know, when I work with clients with trauma, I don't always, I don't share my story all the time, um, but I'm able to identify a lot of the symptoms that they experience. And
Yeah.
so it allows me to give them better insight, as they're trying to explain it, because not everyone can just come and rattle off, I'm experiencing this and this. So I'm able to put the pieces of the puzzle together just about like how they're experiencing what they're experiencing. And it's not just because of the type of trauma I experience, it could be any trauma, because I
Yeah.
just understand
Yeah.
how it functions and I've lived it. And so it allows me to normalize certain behaviors
Yeah.
for individuals. I provide a certain level of validation for them. And most importantly, reassurance and empowerment, because I may share just certain parts of, well, I've experienced this before, or this looks familiar, and so a lot of times when people know that they're not the only person going through what
Yeah.
they're going through, it's almost like a breath of fresh air just comes above them. So it just allows me to establish stronger connections with my clients, and they have a certain high level of trust, that I understand them and I'm gonna take care of what they're going through. Yeah.
I love it. I so appreciate
No
you
problem.
and the information that you provided today. So, why don't you give us some information about your organization and how people can contact you if they have any questions.
Mhm.
If they are, I don't know if you are accepting new clients, but
Mhm.
you know, and I do know that you are licensed in multiple states, so just share that information as well and how people can contact you.
Sure. So I work with children, teen, and adults. So if I had to give an age range, it would be anywhere from 5, up until, 60 plus. And so I am located in Durham, North Carolina. And so I offer virtual appointments or in person, whatever you choose to do. And I'm also licensed in the state of Virginia. So I offer the same, individual counseling, for children and adults. It's just in Virginia, it is virtual sessions only, because I do not have a site, set up just yet in Virginia. The way to contact me is through email first. That's the best way. So it'll be Samara, Samara dot Bowser at the number one journeycounseling.com. And you can email me. I am accepting new clients. I do accept Medicaid and I do accept private insurance. I'm on most private insurance panels, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, most all of them, MedCost. So yeah, just reach out to me. I'm also listed on Psychology Today if you want more of like a full bio, of just, how my interactions with clients are grounded in compassion and, culture, things of that nature. So I'm open to, I don't just see individuals who've experienced some type of trauma. That's just my specialty. I work with a lot of
Yeah.
different types of
Yeah.
disorders. So that's how you can reach out to me.
Wonderful. Well, again, I want to thank you so much, Samara,
Thank
for joining us.
you.
It was a pleasure having you, and so we'll have to get you back on
Absolutely.
sometime in the future. But again, I appreciate you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.